After 4 days of looking, Gabriel has still not experienced 1/10 of Reshizu. He had been right to book a year here. It would take a month just to see the controlled environments, not to mention the tours on land, sea and air out in the wild. The animals and plants were primarily housed in separate buildings, vast complexes that made Sri Venkateswara Zoological Park look puny by comparison, each building containing the fauna from a different world. The one he was currently in was an example of the Nuateru homeworld, a quadrupedal race of tusked herbivores. The air was rich in oxygen, and the gravity was slightly lower than Minigarad. The variety was staggering. Some of the life was so similar that you would mistake it for originating on Earth, others so vastly different they nearly defied all classification. The one that stood out the most was the red belu. It was almost identical to a European red squirrel. The only differences were slightly rounder ears and a marginally less bushy tail. If someone had shown it to Gabriel and told him the red belu was a squirrel before today, he would have believed them. On the other end of the spectrum was the poston, a long, worm-like creature with a muscular trunk, wings on its flanks, and a mouth on its back. It seemed horribly inefficient and was from a world known as Trim, a Class 2H with no native population. That being said, low-level paradise worlds are often so pleasant that they allow bizarre forms that would never survive on more competitive planets. Gabriel checked his watch. It was almost time for the feeding, and as a VIP he had booked the slot to take part. He was a little uncomfortable about being watched, but he wanted to do this, and he wasn't going to let his nerves get in the way. He left the red belu enclosure behind and followed the directions given to him on his PDA. Gabriel knew precisely what to do from the 2 previous events he had partaken in. He began to walk through an opening in the wall marked Staff Only. The path was long, snaking throughout the park, allowing the zookeepers and other employees to move through the complex quickly. Several side paths would have taken him to Rid, Frudek, Wisp and Notor exhibits, but the one that Gabriel was looking for marked Great Majul. Gabriel also appreciated that everything was signposted. He assumed that it was to aid new staff find their way. He encountered a few people along the way, but no one stopped him, asked him what he was doing there. He acted as if he belonged here, so everyone assumed he did. Not that he did not belong. One of the VIP perks was using the staff corridors. He tried not to, though, sticking to the public route wherever possible. It just seemed like the polite thing to do. As he took the next right, he found a bipedal alien, their long, thick fur arranged in elegant plates, a name tag attached to an apron read, Keeper de Stock. "Are you Gabriel Ratelu?" the alien asked, their voice husky and their accent challenging to pass. "Yes," Gabriel replied with a nod. "Now, the show is about to begin. Before we go through, I just need to go through a few safety procedures with you," he explained. Gabriel nodded, which de Stock assumed meant yes. "Good. Now, Great Majul are not violent creatures, but they can get snippy when they feel their food is being threatened. Their beaks can also be quite sharp," de Stock explained. Gabriel looked down at his hands, covered in his suit. It would be rather unlikely that even the lion could puncture it. De Stock also noticed the suit and the rather sturdy material it was made from. "While it may not be an issue for you, I feel we should err on the side of caution," he stated. Gabriel nodded again and replied, "That makes sense." De Stock was pleased that this gentleman was far more reasonable than most. Many VIPs seemed to think that the animals would roll over for them. Ironically, the habitable worlders usually held this attitude, whereas the feral, savage, deaf worlders were far more willing to listen to experts. Most of them, anyway. He recalled to this day that Yarul, who strutted about like he owned the place, ended up getting a lifetime ban. "It is also important that you do not enter the water. I am not doubting your swimming ability, it is just a standard safety protocol," de Stock added. Gabriel nodded and said, "I understand." De Stock's ears waved back and forth, and he replied, "Good. Now what we'll do is grab a bucket, enter the enclosure. I give the talk, we'll feed the animals, answer some questions, and we'll see if the little buggers play ball." Gabriel nodded and smiled slightly beneath his mask. De Stock took that as meaning okay, and led Gabriel inside. The paddock was vast, the size of a football pitch at least, though the stands were far less impressive, only allowing 2 rows of people to sit, or however they reclined. All around were the squawks of the bird-like creatures he had come to feed. It wasn't easy to make out any definitive details, but he knew what the Great Majul looked like from the guide he'd been given. Little bigger than an emperor penguin, with a sturdy beak filled with thin needle-like teeth. Rather than feathers, they were covered in long, flat, flexible and very thin scales, with a chemical composition most similar to chitin, though it was not a strong pound for pound. They lived along the seashore, on rocky cliffs, and were agile in both air and water, though they rarely made long flights in their natural habitat. Gabriel supposed their lifestyle most similar to the puffin, though if the two were ever to compete, Gabriel had a suspicion that the puffin would come out on top. Even though the great Bejewel outsized and outweighed them, the puffin would almost certainly be able to fly farther, faster and fish harder than the Bejewel could. Not really sure why I even thought of that, mused Gabriel. It seemed a little childish to compare every animal here to something on Earth and wonder who would win. Dostok adjusted their headset and said, "Right, now can everyone hear me?" His voice bled out of the speakers dotted around the exterior of the enclosure. The crowd made noise to confirm that they could, as an image of Dostok appeared on the screen so that everyone could see him as well. "Before we begin, I would just like to thank Gabriel Radlew, who has very kindly agreed to help me today," said Dostok. The camera focused on him, and Gabriel felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Don't be afraid to say hello, Gabriel," Dostok said, and in response, Gabriel waved. "That's the thing about there being so many races in the galaxy. You could have just told us all to sod off and we'd be none the wiser," Dostok said with a chuckle. The various people on the stands and standing at the edge of the enclosure made different noises that Gabriel assumed was amusement. Gabriel himself snickered slightly and watched as Dostok began his show. Dostok reached into his bucket and pulled out a couple of fish. They were most likely being vat-grown. It was far cheaper and much more humane than using real fish. These had been cloned and had only the most rudimentary of brain functions. Even jellyfish would have been smarter. As the fish were removed, several of the Bejewel came soaring down. Dostok threw one into the air, and one of the knot birds snatched from the sky. Now, in their natural habitat, they would, of course, not catch her from the air. Instead, they were catching in the water, Dostok explained. He began to walk towards the water's edge, and he threw several herf into the water. "Gabriel, would you care to lend a hand?" Dostok said, and Gabriel blushed as he imagined all those eyes upon him. Thinking it was best to rip the plaster off, he reached into the bucket, grabbed one of the fish and threw. The low gravity made him put too much power into his fling, and it thumped into the perspex screen, separating the crowd from the animals. There were a few gasps as the dead fish left a streak of fluid on the screen as it fell towards the water beneath. Not that the Bejewel cared, they snapped it up before it reached the recreated sea. Dostok said nothing, taken aback by the power in those little arms. He must have thrown it 20 meters or more. He was a professional, though, and Dostok recovered quickly. "It appears someone was a little overeager. Why don't you give it another go, and kindly don't fire one at me?" Dostok said, quickly diffusing what might appear to some of the more delicate viewers as a violent outburst. Gabriel threw another fish. This time it landed into the water, and Bejewel dived in after it. "Now, the great Bejewel are found on every continent of Mordhead, having been introduced to them by the Nimetu. As the great Bejewel, when times are scarce, will prey upon Frel, thereby serving as a primitive pest control system," Dostok explained, pacing around the enclosure, throwing more fish into the water. Gabriel assumed Frel were Mordhead's equivalent of insects, though they must reach far greater sizes with more oxygen and lower gravity. The great Bejewel is native to the southern continent of Edfra. It is also the continent where their numbers are greatest. On Edfra, they hunt such herf and the blue sporple, white frel, darting quat, and the yellow sopal, Dostok stated. Dostok looked up towards the ceiling, shielding his eyes from a non-existent sun, and said, "There she is, people, the resident bully of the flock." A particularly large Bejewel descended from the sky and began to chase away the smaller Bejewel. "That is Doryu. She has been here the longest and isn't afraid to throw her weight around. She'll be 56 this year, and in the wild, she'll be approaching the end of her life, but here at Midigarad, she has access to the best medical care, and we expect her to reach the ripe old age of 140. Doryu, after scaring off most of the other Bejewel, took to the air once more and began circling Dostal. Bejewel are not particularly intelligent animals, but Doryu has lived here long enough to know where the food really comes from, Dostok said, throwing one of the fish into the air. Doryu snatched it and immediately started the circle again. "We try not to encourage this behaviour, but the old girl has grown cantankerous, and she will pester us till she gets what she wants." Doryu landed on a rock and began to make a motion not dissimilar to vomiting. Now, you may notice that Doryu appears to be in distress. In actuality, she had a special pouch called a crop in her throat. This means she can catch several fish before eating them, explained Dostal. Doryu swallowed and ruffled her wings. This serves to make her a more efficient hunter by staying out at sea, rather than returning to land every time she succeeds. The old Bejewel looked at Gabriel and took to the air. She began circling him. Every once in a while, she would dive towards Gabriel and then pull away. He knew what she was doing. She was trying to mob him so that he would drop the bucket and Doryu would get all the fish to herself. Gabriel was not about to play her game. Instead, he grabbed a fish from the bucket and held it in his outstretched hand. "You okay there, Gabriel? She can get a bit snippy with people she doesn't know," asked Desal. I'm fine, replied Gabriel. Doryu attempted to snatch the fish from his hand, but Gabriel yanked it from her snout. Please, don't tease her, said Destal, becoming annoyed with Gabriel for disrespect for the animal. I'm not. I'm trying to get her to behave, said Gabriel. Destal said something in response, but he was so focused on his task that he did not register it. Come on, you won't be able to take it. You have to be polite, thought Gabriel, as Doryu's confidence slowly grew. Finally, the Great Majul realized what she needed to do and landed on Gabriel's arm. He immediately unclenched his fist, and Doryu took the fish. Now that she was up close, Gabriel was taken away by not just her size, but also her weight. Despite being as big as an emperor penguin, Doryu could not weigh more than 8 kilograms. Gabriel gave the Majul another fish and slowly brought the not bird closer to him, supporting one arm with another. The feather-like scales were counter-shaded, black on top, white on the underbelly, providing camouflage, making Doryu a more effective hunter. The only exception was a bright blue patch on her throat. Gabriel had read it was used in communication, nothing complicated, just, my patch is bigger than yours, so get lost. Desal knew where Gabriel was from, but it was one thing to read about humanity's strength, another to see it in person. He just stood there, holding Doryu up like it was nothing. Desal wasn't even mad that he had technically broken the rules by interacting with the Majul. The crowd seemed to be just as impressed as Desal did, and he was nothing if not a competent showman. Well, you saw it here first, people. The first person that Doryu ever respected. Give it up for Gabriel, everyone, Desal called out, and he and the crowd began to make various noises of applause. Gabriel did feel good that everyone was cheering, or their equivalent to cheering, but mostly he just felt uncomfortable, as all those eyes burned into him. His leg began to shake, and Doryu bobbed up and down. He was done. Gabriel did want to hold on to the Majul, but he could not stand being the centre of attention, so copying what he had seen falconers do, he pulled his arm back and flung it forward, giving Doryu a launching start. The Majul did indeed take to the air, but not before lifting her stubby tail and squirting a stream of pale crap all over his chest.